Everyone, George here, and welcome back to the channel. Have not been on for a while. I had COVID, and then I had rebound COVID, so things have been a little bit crazy. We did give away the Whale 200. That is going out in the mail this week. I feel a little bit bad about not getting that out in the mail as quickly as I could, but I really had a really bad case of COVID. But when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about feeding your fish live foods versus pellets and flakes and those kinds of things, and a couple of tips and tricks that I would give you on getting your fish off those foods if you are finding that the supply of blackworms and so forth is not so great. So when we come back, we're going to talk about that. Hang in there with me, and we'll be right back. So as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about live foods versus foods that I recommend that you feed your fish, a good variety of foods, and how to get your fish off these. Sometimes this can be a very difficult situation. The number one thing I would tell you is when you're buying your discus fish or other fish that you're feeding live foods to, check with your supplier that you're getting them from, find out what they're feeding them. Also find out what their pH is. With discus, it's not so much what the pH is exactly, but more about stability. We'll talk about that in another video, or I will put a video, I think it's right up here, about that specific, I think it's a combination of video of different water parameters, but I know there's a video that I had here recently that talked about the stability of pH, especially with discus fish and a few other kinds of fish that people are always concerned about. But as I said, stability is the most important thing. But let's get back to talking about feeding your fish. Blackworms right now are almost impossible to find on the West Coast, and people who are feeding blackworms to maybe their discus fish, their angel fish, or other types of fish that are larger centerpiece fish in their tanks, basically got caught off all of a sudden here and had no ability to get those kinds of foods. Now that kind of situation is something that I've talked about in the past, where if you have live foods that you're only feeding your fish, that's going to be a real problem for you. And what you need to do is wean your fish off those kinds of things. An abrupt ending to that can be very difficult on your fish. They will snub a lot of maybe other foods if that's what they're used to, and it can be very difficult, and they will literally practically starve themselves, especially if you start to see your fish get that little pinched in look, discus fish especially, a pinched in look right around the forehead area, almost like you pinched a piece of clay. That means your fish is slowly starving to death, and it may be hard to get them back. So you don't want to get into a situation like that. So here's a couple of recommendations for you. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I get fish in is to make sure I know what they're being fed at the supplier. As I said, sometimes the supplier is feeding nothing but blackworms, and you really want those fish anyway. And I'm going to give you a couple of ideas on how to get those fish off that. It's not always easy, but it is very possible to do. I recommend that you pick your fish with the kinds of foods that you're willing to feed them, and not get yourself into a situation where, like blackworms, all of a sudden they're off the market and you can't get them, and your fish are, you're throwing food in your tank and they're looking at you like, what's that? So it's very important, in my opinion, that you try as soon as you can to get your fish weaned off these kinds of live foods and start doing something else. So one of the recipes for doing that is to take a concoction of maybe some frozen black worms. There's some good frozen foods out there that are a mixture of different things that are made specifically for discus that have some worm components in there. The fish will see these in the water and they will try them. Maybe it'll take 2 or 3 days for them to actually get used to it, but that's one way. The second way is to make up your own food in little small cubes. There are cubes on Amazon that are specifically for doing these kinds of things, and what I recommend is putting in maybe some bloodworms that are frozen, not live bloodworms. Anything that's a live bloodworm is not good for your fish, and you're going to get parasites. You don't want to do that. But if you've got some kind of a food that is made by a very established supplier, I would recommend buying those frozen foods that say parasite free on them, guaranteed parasite free, because you can pretty much count on the fact that they're not going to have problems because they're raised in a way where parasites just are not in that kind of frozen situation. So you can take some of those, melt those down. You can take a little bit of discus food. I think it's made by Haiku, both of these maybe, and you can melt these down, put a little bit of pellets in there, put a little bit of other brands of food in there that you want them to try to eat, some flake, and start dropping small amounts of that in your tank. Do not put a ton of it in there because they're going to reject it for the first few times, and unless you have dither fish or other fish that are bottom feeders and so forth, you may have some problems getting your fish to eat right away, and then you've got all this extra food in your water just polluting your tank, and that's something absolutely you don't want to do, obviously. So my recommendation is to make up some cubes like this. I have found that 90% of the time you may get a little bit of rejection on those foods for a day or two, but they'll come around. They'll start to see that there's some worms in there, and if they look like they're in a group like worms are, this is the stimulation that causes them to eat these foods in the first place. If there's a little bit of that going on, that's going to be very helpful for your fish to be stimulated to eat. Raise the temperature up in your tank. Put it to around 89 degrees, making their metabolism go up. They're going to get very hungry, and they're going to accept these foods a lot faster if you take the time to raise the temperature up. And again, while you're doing this, another thing I would do is make sure you're upping your water changes a little bit, because your tank, as I said, can get very contaminated or polluted. So be very careful with that. Watch your water parameters and so forth as far as ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates. Don't worry about pH, as I said, a stable pH. These fish, most of them have been tank raised, other than wilds. Wilds is a whole different story, but you can wean them off these kinds of foods too. But be careful that you are making sure that you're trying to get these fish from a supplier, as I said, that you already know that they're eating these kinds of foods in the first place, and then you can avoid this whole thing. But if you've got fish, like I said earlier in the video, that you absolutely want to have, and you know that they're just eating black worms and that kind of thing, you want to make sure that you get them off that as quick as possible, because it can be a problem. I hope this was a helpful video for you. I know I maybe jammered on a little bit here about it, but it's very important to me to make sure. I've been getting a lot of questions on this as I put out these videos. People are asking me, what are you feeding your fish? Do you feed your fish live foods? Blah, blah, blah. And even though I explain it, there may be new viewers that don't watch some of my older videos. I hope you will go back and watch some of those videos, because they're very informative and they have some good information for you that's going to help you to keep your fish tanks very healthy, and your fish, most importantly, more healthy as well. So thank you for joining me today. Take the time to really think about what you're doing when you buy your fish. Ask lots of questions about how they're caring for them. Maybe go back 2 or 3 times to the supplier that you're looking at getting them from. See how they're doing. If you're buying them online from maybe Jack Watley Discus, is where I get my fish. Ask other people who have had experiences with Jack Watley, such as myself, to find out if they're having problems with getting their fish to eat. I rarely run into that situation with Jacks. Occasionally on wild fish that are caught and I buy from him, then I may have a situation like that. But typically, as I said, I'm able to get these fish to get off the the live foods and able to get them to move towards these other foods that are much more nutritious in the long run. They're going to make your fish more colorful. They're going to make your fish more excited and move around your tank a lot better. No hiding and any of that stuff. So just keep that in mind. Now, one last thing before I go, hit the like button on this, subscribe, comment down below if you have something that you specifically want to know about regarding feeding your fish. I will get back to you as quick as I can. And, you know, it's always nice if you leave me a little something in the thank you department. You don't have to do that, but if you can, I appreciate it. It helps the channel. And also share the videos with your friends, because there's nothing like word of mouth to get a channel to really move ahead. And that's kind of where my channel's headed right now. So I appreciate that. Again, check that bell up at the top there and make sure you've got that working, so anytime there's a new video that comes out by me, you're going to be one of the first ones to know about it. Again, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. We will see you on the next one. We got a lot of great stuff coming up. Now that I'm not sick, we can get moving on some of this stuff. Some new tanks that I'm putting together, some bigger tanks, and I think you're really going to enjoy some of the scapes that we're going to be doing, and also some of the unusual combinations of fish that I'm going to go with here. And again, thank you for joining me. We'll see you on the next one. Until then, we are out of here.